Hey guys, this is Khan, and I'm coming back to you with the fifth round of the FIDE World Rapid 2013 tournament, following Mamedyarov's games. He's black here against Li Kwang Liem 27-12, Mamedyarov's 27-53. It's black in this game, d4, d5, c4. So we saw in an earlier round, I'm not sure if you remember, that Mamedyarov played c5 here, which I said was uncommon, unusual. So given that he's played that previously, it could either be something that he's prepared for multiple games, purely based on this rapid format, thinking that it's somewhat unusual and people aren't going to know exactly what to do against it, but he still thinks it's a reasonable line, or it could have just been something gimmicky prepared against his previous opponent. Okay, and he plays c5 again, so it implies that he's prepared this opening for this kind of rapid tournament. I haven't seen him use it in a long play game, and I kind of wouldn't expect him to play it in a long play game, but I could be wrong. My general thoughts on the opening, I kind of went over it in the last video where he played this. Can't remember what round it was, one of the first few. So I'm not going to go straight over that again, we'll just try and get to a middle game position. Knight 3, knight f6, captures. Okay, so I think we talked here last time about the difference between queen takes and knight takes. On here, and whether we wanted to take on d4 first, and I believe in the last game he took on d4. But it pretty much just dissolves the centre a bit. And because we've got this identical kind of pawn format, once these pawns are gone, like these D and C pawns, because they're gone on both sides, it's just rather open. And there's no real imbalances in pawn structure. So that kind of implies it's going to be quite an even game if that happens. Whereas if you try and keep the tension by not trading these pawns, much more complicated position can develop, which you could argue is a stronger player you want. But I think at this level where everyone's 2700 plus, you'll be happy with simplifying the position as black, I think. But there's also an option that white can take in a lot of cases when he's unused to the opening and he wants to make sure he's playing safe and not directly into some preparation where he could get worse, having not studied the line as deeply as his opponent. Okay, so he takes on d4, knight takes, queen takes, knight c3, queen e5, knight b3, queen c7. Queen c7 makes most sense here because it's still an active square, and we're not blocking anything. If we go back to, say, b6, then we're blocking this b-pawn, which means we can't play e6 in combination with b6 and bishop b7, that kind of thing. And if we play something more aggressive, you might think, with like queen b4, this can put us in trouble, because firstly we can just be pushed away by a3. And then the queen has to go to another spot where it's not going to be as good as c7, because here it's kind of blocking like this bishop f4 move, or at least forcing g3 first, in which case it will give us time for, b6, and then some move, and then bishop b7, so it's a pretty reasonable square basically. Whereas on b4, if we're pushed away from a3, if we go to c4, a move of the e-pawn is going to attack the queen at tempo via this bishop. Can't go to c5 because of this knight. If we go anywhere else along this diagonal, we're going to be very vulnerable to like knight b5 moves and threats on c7, in combination with this bishop f4. So it just makes the most sense. I'd expect e4 or e4 in this position from white, just because it opens up this bishop and allows him to delay the development of this bishop until he's decided on what he wants to do. Probably f4 is the best spot at the moment, but you really need to support that somehow. And if you do it via g3, then there's less emphasis on, I guess, the e-pawn move, because you want to put this bishop on g2 likely, since you've opened the diagonal here. And if you just open up your pawn structure with g3 to allow this hole on g2 and you don't put your bishop there, it is basically just that hole. So you kind of want a consistent plan between your pieces. So e4 is played. Knight c6, all just normal development moves. You could play something like e5 here, but I guess black thinks that e5 from white is no threat at the moment, which is correct because queen can take it, and he just wants to, develop his pieces first, because it's still possible to play this pawn to e6 instead of e5. And basically the idea of playing it to e6 would be to support this d5 square against this knight move. So we could see something in the future with like, an aggressive knight move such as knight d5, or if he's played e6 then knight b5, and we might see something like the queen on b8 and white trying to get this bishop to have force somehow to allow some c7 thing, but we'll see. Bishop e2. Okay, and e6 is played. Yeah, the problem with playing e5, I think, is just this hole on d5, because if he allows knight d5 after, say, bishop f3, which is kind of implied after bishop e2, otherwise you just put this bishop on a more active square. Yeah, it would just allow white to further reinforce this d5 square, because if the bishop is on f3, as well as the knight and the queen and the pawn supporting this, there's no way for black to really dislodge it, and having that knight in the centre just gives white so much space that black's always going to be a little worse because of that. It just won't have the manoeuvrability that white will. When I say bishop f3, this could be before f4, but it's much more likely that f4 is played in combination with it, because then you have the option to push the c5 pawn, especially in combination with this e6 move, because then white can push e5 and plant his own knight on e4 once this knight is forced to move, and that gives a very strong central knight. And yeah, basically this bishop is not blocking any of white's pawns, and it also gives more space to this rook on f1, because it'll have an extra couple of squares of scope, which otherwise would be blocked by this f2 pawn. Okay, so e6 is played, castles, bishop e4, knight b5 is played, so the queen is forced to move. I would expect queen b8 here. May not be the most logical move for some people to see, but basically we have to defend the c7 square against knight c7 check, so that leaves us with only knight b6, which can be pushed away with bishop e3, queen d8, which white can then trade queens and play a quick rook d1, which either keeps the king in the centre or forces this knight to a more passive square, both of which aren't particularly good for black, because he's just up behind on development. White's already castled. So queen b8 is pretty much the only good square, and that's what he plays. If he plays something like queen d7 just to trade queens, again, white can just trade, and then black is forced into recapturing the king, which puts his king in the centre, because otherwise knight c7 check comes, winning the rook. So queen b8, a3 is played, pushing this bishop away, so bishop e7 again looks like the only move, because we need to stop this knight d6 check idea, just because we want to be able to castle our king in the future, keep it safer, and then knight c3 back. So I'm not particularly sure if that helped black at all. In fact, I don't think it really did. By getting white to play a3, he's just taken away this b4 square for black's pieces in the future, so seems kind of strange to me that black played bishop b4 in the first place. I just played bishop e7 originally, there's nothing wrong with that, but maybe it transposes. Maybe he figures that white has to play this knight c3 back to support the c4 pawn without making his other pieces kind of cramped, like I said, forcing this bishop f3 to support this pawn, or making him play f3 so he's not playing f4 in one move, or just something like that. Or it could really be the case that he's seen far enough ahead, whereby he thought queen c2 is an option, but because we've moved our queen from c7 to b8, after later bishop d7 castles and rook c8, this queen is now going to be in line with our rook and we can gain a tempo later on. That said, this is rapid. I don't think he's thinking that deeply. I doubt he's in opening preparation still, because this just seems like a relatively weird position where white is just ever so slightly better based on the higher amount of space he has, and his bishop being better than white c8 bishop, black c8 bishop rather, because this really has nowhere good to go. I was talking earlier about putting on b7 against this diagonal, but if white keeps his pawn here, then this is always blunted, and I don't think that's so great. So maybe actually better would be to try and still push e5 and then play bishop e6, develop it that way. I don't think this knight d5 is going to be as much of an issue later on, because as soon as black is castled, then he's not going to be as much trouble from immediate captures and then pawn recaptures and the opening of this e-file, which before could be problematic, because if we have an open e-file, white's already castled, black hasn't, you can get this rook here, stare straight at the king, which can tie black up. Castle, bishop e3, rook d8, queen c2. Okay, so e5 is played. This makes sense now as well. This is like good timing for it, because white's pieces are more aiming around this d4 square, and if black can blockade it and get his bishop in, say, the e6 position, where it can have the option of trading off for this knight, which is a piece that protects against d4, then we can have our fair share of control of the middle of the board, which when we don't have the c5 move in, we don't, because white has an extra row of squares, essentially. So e5 is played, rook d1, bishop e6 is played, rook trade. Yeah, okay, so the reason this makes sense is because this rook is seriously undeveloped, but this rook really isn't any better, because it only supports this middle rook, and it's not doing anything here, and we can't really improve the position of it, unless we go for like rook e1 and just like a slow kind of central push. So what white's doing is he's trading off this rook, because he can then play this rook d1 with tempo on the queen, and although this is going to allow a queen move and then this rook moving to trade, he gains an extra tempo here, and he probably thinks he can do something useful like a knight move, like knight b5 after queen c7, or knight c5 threatening this bishop, trying to win the two bishops, which generally is considered a slight advantage, having two bishops against a bishop and a knight in a relatively open position. But okay, queen e8 was played. I was thinking of queen e7. Queen e8 is probably better, because it doesn't allow this knight b5 kind of move. So knight c5 is played. I don't think black is anything better than giving up the two bishops here. This bishop c8 is seriously backwards, and I think with b4, b5, he can just kind of overwhelm black pieces to the point where they get too passive, so material falls. So black should probably just trade here, which he does, and he should look to trade, I think, the other rook as well, and then just kind of have the position with queen and pieces against queen and pieces, and that's just gonna allow for a more open game. Generally, when you've got less pieces, less space rather, trading off pieces is good, because it just rids a lot of the congestion of the potential spaces that are covered by the other person's pieces, if you see what I mean there. Okay, so rook c8 instead of rook d8. This is fine. H3 kind of a weird move, but I guess it's just to cover this g4 square. In rapid, it's always good just to give your king some space, within reason. And there's no real threat of black moving this knight to discovery on the queen, because there's still two more pieces blocking it. So knight a5 is played, and then bishop e5, which is good because it attacks this queen, takes away space, kind of exploits this knight moving, because that option wasn't there before. So yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I was wondering how black was going to deal with this, because if he plays bishop d7 here, if he takes it, black has to recapture the knight so that he doesn't lose his queen to the rook, And this knight d5 coming in is going to be really strong. Of course, you can't play knight d5 immediately because of this hanging via the knight and this rook. But with something like b4, it's going to attack his knight and it's going to support this bishop, and then the knight d5 is looking really strong because it threatens like knight e7 with check, picking up this rook, and that looks really awkward. So this counterattack actually is probably the best scenario. So if white takes this queen, black takes the queen, white can have an in-between move with taking off 7 with check, but black recaptures that and then he's up a bishop and we're not able to recapture this queen, so tricks like that don't work. So white essentially has to do something with the queen now, or he just takes here, and then after the capture of his queen he moves his rook to protect, well, to attack this bishop on c2. The problem with this is it leaves open the option for white to take on c5 as well as take on e8, and that, you know, could be an issue, although maybe not, because then b4 can be played, which would fork the rook and the knight, so maybe it's just kind of an even trade. So yeah, I guess we'll just see what happens. I think probably the other option is fine. Yeah, so queen c1, when I said the other option is fine, what I meant was the option of just moving our queen out the way, or allowing the trade. But moving the queen out the way implies to me that he's playing in a more aggressive format. He still thinks his position is slightly better, so he wants to keep pieces, or he wants to keep the queens on, which should leave more play in the position, which, you know, is brave, but it could be good in rapid against such a strong player if he thinks he's up enough time, or if he thinks his position is sufficiently better. It's nice c6 back is played here. Probably a good move again because of this b4 in the future potential, or just bishop b4, attacking this knight, getting his bishop out of the way of this rook. That's just knight c6 back. So he's going to have to move his rook now. d6 makes sense. Makes sense because we're putting more pressure on this c6 square, which is already pinned, and it's going to allow the movement of this queen to the d file to support this rook. And if we've got this double pressure on the d file, it's going to make it very hard for black to kind of trade off by playing like rook d8 and trading off more pieces, because then we always have the bishop takes c6, hitting the queen option. And if takes d6 there, we have, you know, the intermediate queen takes, and then after queen takes c6, recapturing. White's the option of trading queens, and this will just leave this b pawn on c6 and this a pawn hanging. So this a pawn would fall, and this c6 pawn would be an island against this passed a pawn with no opposition. White being a pawn up, and also being able to play b4 to support it, even if there was some kind of dispute. And with this pawn being weak and isolated, bringing the king in, it's just going to give a win to white. So a6 was played, it kind of forces the issue. If white takes now, after rook captures, queen captures, black's fine. In fact, he's more than fine because he's starting to take on e4 as well as c5. So I imagine white either has to take here and then not capture back immediately, or he can retreat the bishop somewhere instead. So after bishop e2 with knight d4, let's put that extra pressure on this bishop. Also opens up this rook attacking the c5 bishop, and it's kind of forcing white into a decision. White doesn't want to take on d4, allowing the recapture via the pawn, which hits this knight. It kind of pins this knight, which, well, it attacks this knight, which is pinned via this queen, via the rook against the queen. So it essentially forces white to recapture with the rook after this, and then e4 falls. By taking on e4 with a knight, we're going to be able to again re-establish this pin on c3 against this. And in the combination of queen, I guess this is e5, after it attacks this rook. If this rook moves, it's extra pressure on here. Then we're gonna have the reverse scenario with black can take on c3 enough times to save the knight, the rook, and the queen. It's going to leave a situation where the a and this b2 pawn being on c3, the pawns are now split, whereas the pawns are solid here on a and b for black. And in the endgame, this is going to be an advantage for black, because this is going to be very hard to defend in a king and pawn endgame, whereas these pawns support each other, so it's not nearly as bad. Which follows entrances to white's king, and it can create a lot of scenarios where black can create Zugzwang and have the king forced to move in a position whereby he could put his king in a position between the pawns on this b3 square, and force white to make another move, and then he can take off the straggling pawn, and he can just promote this and win. So captures cap. Okay. So what he's doing here is he's immediately going for this pin. It means that this bishop, we're temporarily down a piece because we're not recapturing the bishop immediately. But, he's attacking this rook at the same time, so the rook kind of has to move as well. He could try something like bishop takes the pawn here, and then after the queen recaptures, if he takes here and then the queen recaptures, we're just re-establishing some pin, which isn't so good for black. But if he takes here and then he immediately takes the rook with the knight, after the bishop recapturing here, you can play something like queen takes e2, then after knight takes, rook takes c1, knight takes c1, we're in a position where the pawn count is even, the material count is even, but black is going to have a bishop on b3, which has to move because the knight on c1 attacks it. But he's going to have a bishop against this knight, and he can use this bishop here far more effectively in the endgame than this knight can be used in an endgame where it's just pawns, kings, and one minor piece, and he has 2 pawn islands. Generally, you say in the endgame that the knight is going to be the better piece when it's all on 1 pawn island, which means that all the pawns are connected. But because we've got 2, the bishop is the far better piece because it allows things to happen on both sides of the boards, where the knight is far more limited in its scope. So, there might be a better line for white along there, but I'm just immediately looking to that endgame line. I'm seeing that it's a no-risk endgame for black, where he has very good chances of winning. So, okay, so rook b6 was played. So the idea now is that if black takes on e4, which makes sense, is that intermediate move, white can now take on b3 and recapture material that way. That said, I think black will still go for that because it's going to result in this split pawn kind of endgame, which I talked about before. So takes, he does take on b3, knight takes. The reason he does this is because it trades off an extra piece. If he just plays pawn takes, then yeah, he's going up a piece, but after the recapture there's a bishop against a knight. Whereas if he takes with a knight here, after any recapture, this e2 bishop hangs. So he's bringing it to a queen and rook endgame, as opposed to a queen, rook and knight against queen, rook and bishop. And that's probably the right decision in this scenario, because here if we take bishop f3, it's going to be really awkward for black to kind of deal with, because he can't solidify this knight without opening up his king, let's say f5, which allows this long diagonal here for checks. And it's just something he doesn't want to have to deal with, so he's kind of simplifying it. The only thing I would say is queen and rook endgame is pretty drawish. I guess maybe he thinks that this pawn is going to be sufficiently advanced where he can put enough pressure on white to kind of convert that edge and promote it. Which, if that's the case, is definitely the right decision. it's really good foresight from him. But given the rapid time format, I would imagine that it's more of a kind of intuition thing rather than knowing that he's going to be able to convert it. Probably thought there was also far less risk to this position, which I'm sure he's right about. So takes b7. Only move really because we can't take here as the queen hangs to the rook. And then f6 was played, so that's interesting. I guess that means he wants to take on c3 with the rook, allowing the pushing of this pawn on the d file. I mean, white can't check immediately, but I would be rather... Oh no, it's a rather risky move because it allows checks, which other moves, such as g6, wouldn't. So I think this is actually why he's a super GM, and I'm not, right? Because I think this move, having seen it just now, makes sense because he's opening up this king to actually use it in the endgame to push it up here. So what he's doing is he's seeing that there's no way for this queen to be able to check him, because obviously in combination, like if his queen could be put on b3 now, then it could come to f7. Threat mates all over the place, force black's rook passive, and it's an easy draw, better for white. I mean, it's just a draw, it's not better, but still. So he's been able to see that white can't do that, and because this, I mean, basically his reasoning for that is because this queen is too tied down to the defending of the c-pawn, stop the back rack stuff, and stop the promotion. And because he knows that once his trades of queens comes in, he wants the fastest routes possible to get to this b3 square, which I talked about earlier, like the split pawn scenario. And if he can get his king there faster than white can, which is very probable when his king is able to move. I mean, it can't move currently because of this rook position, but if this rook were to move, then his king would be able to promote itself along this kind of diagonal, whereas this king is still very much cut off by the good queen position, which isn't likely to change quickly, whereas this rook position may do, because it may be required to defend the c-pawn if... well, yeah, it's to defend the c-pawn basically, because black had the option of taking here, and he chose not to. So he could have played pawn takes pawn, and you might think, oh well, if, queen can take it, because if rook takes the back rank mate. So I guess that's why he didn't. But this f6 move instead of g6 for h6 is very interesting to me, just because I think I've worked out his plan behind that is to help the promotion of his king, and it's just really cool that you'd be able to understand the position at such low time to realise that it's not a threat. Okay, so queen b1 coming in now is a threat, so I would say that he's just going to pick up the c3 pawn now, probably via his pawn, because we want to keep this rook on the back rank to avoid checks. And then after I say queen b3, you can use queen c4 to defend, so... Okay, so that happened. Now queen c2 to block. So that said, we've got this position, we're up a pawn. This pawn is well positioned, but we need to be able to put our queen in a position whereby on, say, d2 or b2, that we can, force either the trade of queens, or the movement of the queen to whereby we can push the pawn. So yeah, it's just to do that whilst avoiding these kind of checks. That's going to be the issue. And this video is already half an hour long. I've been trying to talk quite quickly, so I'm just going to kind of get through this, see if he can manage it. It's very awkward for white to defend because he has to get his king into the position somehow, and that's cut off by the queen's position at the moment. Black's plan immediately might be something like rook d2, rook d8 to d2 instead of the queen, just because he wants to keep this queen on this diagonal to prevent all the queen checks. So we'll see what happens. Okay, queen d5. So that hits the rook and, you know, kind of threatens, I guess, queen d2. Rook b1, queen d2, rook c1. Oh, okay, and queen d5. That's interesting. So that tells me that he doesn't have confidence that he can win this endgame. If he trades queens, which is probably correct, because if he trades and recapture, basically we can just count squares and we can see that by the time black can get here, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 times, white walls will have 4 move and it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, so they both kind of reach here at the same time, which will mean the kings meet here and here, and by the queen being here and his king being here, it will mean that the c3 pawn can be picked up by white, so that will leave it with even material and an equal pawn structure, so that's just going to be a draw. Gets queen d5 back, so it shows that he's playing for more. Rook move here, h3, okay. So if there's a capture here by the rook, we have queen d1 check, we should pick up this and win. That's why he's leaving this here. I'm just going to keep going quickly. Okay, so by the promotion of this pawn, what he's doing is allowing himself to play queen b3, and when I mentioned earlier that he could play queen d2 or queen b2, this is where he's going along the b2 plan. He thinks this rook has kind of prevented this other plan. But by going on b2, he can stop all these queen checks along here, which he couldn't from d2. So that's kind of cool. Again, here he can play here because of this trick. Okay, so now queen b3 comes in. Rook's under attack though. So back to c4, back there, so maybe... Okay, so he's still playing for more. Checks here, and then back to c7, rook e7. Idea is if queen takes rook check, and then he also picks up this. Oh, and then you just play c2, very nice. So the idea here is if he takes, not to promote the queen, because then the rook could take this queen as well, but to actually recapture this rook with his rook, and then, although we're down in material, because he's got queen against the rook and the pawn, there's no way for this queen to prevent this pawn from queening, even though he's given the option of queen e6 and queen d5 check. From these squares he can play king h8, and from no position is he going to be able to check to win this rook, or put his queen on c1. So that's really clever, and I mean, given the assumed time that's left, that's pretty crazy. They go for something so risky. So the queen check is played first, another check. f5, so white can take that with check. So why did he do that? Not sure. Because if we play something like king h8, okay. So here's the problem. If he plays king h8 here, then white can just take the queen here, and after the recaptures, like we mentioned before, he can actually play queen d8 check, because the king is on h8, and then pick up this rook on c7, which covers against the pawn. Whereas if he forces it to f5, from here, he doesn't have queen d8 check because he's not on the d file. And now he can't get back to the d file with that check. And he also can't get back to c1 to block. So now this is looking very good for black. He basically has to do something to try and mate straight away. So yeah. Okay, so queen g4 again, quite clever, because you think, oh, black can just take this rook, but then again, takes this rook here and picks up this pawn. Okay, so queen c3 is played, which protects against g7. Now rook is taken, because again we have this queen takes here, move. He's actually able to promote the pawn this move, because there's no way for white to checkmate him from this position, because this rook protects against here. So he's got another queen. Now, rook here is played. No immediate threat because of, you know, this queen c3 covering against here. This queen here protects against this pawn. So I think white's just busted now. Okay, didn't resign. Queen g5. Queen e4, again threatening mate here. But yeah, okay, so just queen g8 is played. And this covers against both this and this. So now I really don't know what I can do. I mean queen f4, but then just queen g6. And then there's no more options because this queen covers every mating square and it covers this h6 pawn. Okay, queen f4 is played. Queen g6. Okay, now there's no more moves, so yeah, white resigned here. So this is where Mamedyarov picks up another win. So it's kind of cool playing this interesting opening again. Don't particularly like it. I think white was a little bit better, but he'd make good decisions with these kind of going for these complications here, which are, I don't know. This was clever. This middle bit. He found an in-between move here, and by getting this pawn structure at the end, white actually has some really nice trick ideas, trying to win back this rook and so on, but he just managed to calculate this. Probably the most interesting move for me was this f6 move. I'll just check the engine quickly. It thinks white is 3/4 of a pawn worse, so black is better. It says queen e6 here. f6 is its second best move. But again, it's slightly changing. If I put in, say, this move, it suddenly thinks white is better because of queen f4. Well, white is only very marginally better after queen c4, but still, it's interesting. It's very interesting that computers also recognises this. So I think f6 is not only to allow this king to come out, it's also because it blocks like queen f4 moves, because this pawn acts as a buffer to all the attacks along the f file against this f7. It's pretty cool. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I worked out last time that no, I can't upload videos in this format and MP4, so I have to download a converter, but hopefully, well, I mean it's not too much of an issue for me, it's just a slight complication, which is annoying, but I'll deal with it. You know, I started this series here, so I'd like to end it here, and this recording software is just so much easier to use that I'm just going to stick with it and keep conversing it. Anyway, let me know what you thought. Comments always appreciated. And I'll see you guys next time.